Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, but as always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, development stories, release stories, marketing stories, all the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try really hard not to do snark. I try really hard not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how difficult it is to get a movie onto the big screen. And that is enough preamble. I'm going to crack on with this episode of Film Stories. And as always, I'm going to set it up with a clip from the trailer. I'll take you over to this one. We're going back to the 1990s. Here's the clip. Come to the story. The other side of this.
In the city of New York, a crime is committed every 8 seconds. But just across the river lies a quiet town called Garrison, New Jersey, where New York's finest return home.
The hero cop, unwilling to trust the system, jumps from the George Washington Bridge. Today, he is laid to rest here in the cemetery at Garrison, New Jersey.
So what brings you to our fair city? I heard it was a way of life out here. Thought I'd check it out for myself.
Where we, like the Amish now?
It's a place where the sheriff wears the badge, but the cops own the town.
My jurisdiction ends at the George Washington Bridge. But half the men I watch live beyond that bridge, where no one's watching. I'm watching. Effectively, the sheriff of Copland.
He always dreamed of becoming one of them.
I'd like you to meet Sheriff Freddie Heflin.
Freddie's a hell of a guy.
Well, you should call me.
But now, he has uncovered something that could force him to choose between protecting his idols and upholding the law.
So that's a clip from 1997's Copland, written and directed by James Mangold, with a really starry cast: Sylvester Stallone, Harvey Keitel, Ray Liotta, Robert De Niro, Peter Berg, Janine Garofalo, Robert Patrick, Michael Rapaport, Annabella Sciorra, amongst the extensive ensemble for the film. The origins, though, they go back to James Mangold, the writer-director of the movie. Now, Mangold grew up and found his way into working for Walt Disney Pictures, co-writing a feature, Oliver and Company, for instance. But he had in his head that he wanted somewhere along the line to make a Western, but he didn't feel capable to write a period Western. Instead, what he decided to do was look around him at the world that he knew and decided to come up with a tale that was modern, a modern town close to the one that he grew up in, that he saw almost as a kind of modern frontier, that he could put Western themes underpinning it, but he would put very modern cloaking on it. And so he came up with this idea of citing the story in the town just outside of New York, where people would go into New York to commute for work, but they wouldn't live there for fun. They would come out again as soon as they possibly could, and this whole idea just germinated in his head. And so it was while he was working at Disney in the mid-1980s, well, eventually, let's just say, he moved away and he went over to Columbia University to study film. And one of the tutors there was the legendary director Milos Forman, films such as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, for instance. And it was under Forman's tutelage that he developed the screenplays to his first two movies. That would be Heavy, which would come out in 1995, and Copland, which is the one that we're basically here to talk about. And so when it came to Copland specifically, the first draft of it would take him around a month to do. He'd take influence from westerns such as Shane, for instance, and he started making what he saw as a fable, just a tale that he then wondered if he could put a fairly straightforward, simple law and order story at the heart of it. Now, Mangold had actually been fired from Disney at the age of 21, and he'd been fired for basically sticking to his guns on something and not ceding to a corporate demand. And he was working towards writing and directing Heavy, which was his very low-budget debut feature. But the script for Copland made it to a producer by the name of Kathy Conard in 1994. Now, she was making the film Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead at this point. I really like that film, actually. And she'd been sent the screenplay by Mangold's manager just as Mangold was getting heavy, just about off the ground. Now, the screenplay was 149 pages, the version that she took delivery of. She handed it to a fellow producer, a man called Kerry Woods, and Woods read it and suggested they buy it. There was, however, a problem here, and the condition of purchase was that the writer of the script, James Mangold, wanted to direct the script, James Mangold. And at this point in 1994, James Mangold was really an unproven entity when it came to directing feature. He's the fellow who got chucked out of Disney. He was still several months, a year away from his first film starting to do the rounds. But Conard really loved the character. She really wanted to make the film, and Woods then also was really taken by what he was reading. So he flew to New York, met James Mangold, had a conversation, got the measure of him, and they made the deal. Now, it wasn't then a case of instantly everything fell into place, because a couple of things were happening. First of all, there was basically a year of further development work to improve the script, in which time Heavy came out. And then also Woods was on the lookout for funding for the film, and so he sent the script for the attention of Bob Weinstein. Now, Bob Weinstein of Miramax and Dimension Pictures, he ran the genre side of things, Dimension. It was felt it was more a script for Harvey Weinstein, the now convicted rapist. But Bob Weinstein was the contact that Woods had, and he kind of gambled, if I get it to Bob Weinstein, he's going to pass it to his brother, which is basically, in the end, what happened. And so Miramax came on board, and it came on board fairly early in the midst of all of this as well. But contextually, it's worth noting, this was just the kind of picture that they were looking for, because 1994 was the year that Pulp Fiction exploded. Now, Pulp Fiction is, I'm going to come back to over the course of this podcast, but there was a new film from an upcoming writer-director with an ensemble cast, but after the success of Pulp Fiction, and that success was still ongoing at the point Copland's script was purchased, well, people were on the lookout for the next one. And as a result, independent filmmakers were suddenly coming into the limelight an awful lot more, and there was a window, really, to get films from really quite scalable films from relatively unknown filmmakers off the ground. What this also meant as well was that movie stars were on the lookout for slightly more ambitious projects, because the first person who actually joined the ensemble of Copland was Sylvester Stallone. And this is the kind of piece of casting that sent shockwaves, again, completely around the town. Because you look at the films that Sylvester Stallone had been making at this point in the 1990s. He was just coming on the slightly downward side of his latest career revival that sparked with 1993's duo of Cliffhanger and Demolition Man. But then subsequent films such as The Specialist and Judge Dredd, Assassins, Daylight as well, for which he's paid an awful lot of money, they didn't really hit at the box office, and Stallone was getting a little bit weary. He's been fairly open about this, but as Mangold notes in the book Down and Dirty Pictures by Peter Biskind, the idea of sending it to Sylvester Stallone, well, Mangold realised Pulp Fiction had just happened, Miramax had this tremendous prestige, and he said, I was excited that I wouldn't be working at a studio. Everybody wanted to be in the next Pulp, so I was able to meet almost anybody for the role. Stallone was one of them, but other names expressing interest were people like Tom Hanks, Tom Cruise, Sean Penn, John Travolta. And in the case of John Travolta, well, they got quite far down the line with putting an offer in that Harvey Weinstein went directly to Travolta to try and negotiate for him to take the lead role in Copland. But there was a little bit of tension there, because Travolta had done Pulp Fiction at a reduced rate, and Weinstein was almost playing it really as if he'd resurrected Travolta's career. Now, Travolta's argument was, well, he had something to do with that as well, that he was grateful for the opportunity, but it wasn't a case of it's 100% down to one party, 0% down to the other. And so the idea of doing Weinstein a favour and doing a second cut price role in a film of this ilk, well, no, it wasn't that Travolta wasn't interested in being in Copland. He just wanted to be paid a price for it, a price that Weinstein, despite all of his efforts, just simply wasn't willing to cough up. So then came the idea of Stallone, and Mangold would admit he was hugely surprised at the mention of him, because why on earth would he want to play such a vulnerable character? This is Rambo at this point, this is Rocky. But Stallone was looking for something different, and also he'd watched Heavy and he'd liked it as well, and so the pair of them met up. Stallone had been told about the script by his agent, and the agent had basically said, it's a really good script but it's not right for you, and that set something off in Stallone's head. It's just like, well, why isn't it for me? Because it's often forgotten Stallone got into this as an actor. It wasn't an action star who turned up on the set of Rocky for the first day. He was an actor looking for a role. He's had Academy Award nominations for his acting, and here was a chance to get back to that a little bit. He was tired of action films at this point, and so he chased the script down. He chased it down to Miramax, and it was Stallone's agent in the end who called James Mangold and said, well, what do you think of Sylvester Stallone for the lead role in your film? And Mangold, admittedly, as he admits, was reluctant, because here also was a young director who never directed a movie star. This was absolutely new territory to him. So, I mean, if you look at the age of James Mangold, he, at the point he was coming round to making Copland, I mean, he was heading towards his early to mid 30s, but this was only going to be his second feature film, and all of a sudden one of the most recognisable movie stars on the planet was interested in taking a role, and bluntly, was he right for it? And so what this allowed Mangold to do, what this doubt in his head allowed him to do, was just be forthright, really, when the pair of them met. And this is explored on the DVD commentary, in fact, that Mangold was just telling Stallone, you've got to go back to square one. I don't want Rambo in this film. I don't want Rocky. I don't want the Stallone that people knew. And for Stallone as well, this was kind of music to his ears, because that's what he was looking for as well, something different. And Mangold just challenged him. It's just like, also, part and parcel of this character is he's a heavier character just in terms of physical weight than the ones you're playing. You can't be this absolutely bulked up guy. He's almost got to be a forgettable character actor kind of thing. Well, not forgettable, but it's got to be that kind of character actor mentality, not the movie star mentality. To Mangold's surprise, well, Stallone was up for it, and Harvey Weinstein was rubbing his hands with glee. I mean, there's an announcement press conference where they sat behind a table. There's Mangold, there's Weinstein, there's Stallone. You've got no doubt who's put this together. And Stallone talking about those early days he had as an actor, when he would just not have an extensive trailer, he'd just have a rubbishy station wagon, and that would be it. And he sort of wanted to get back to the station wagon days. The casting was news. I mean, fairly extensive news actually, right around the world. That it was a shock, but perhaps going back to Pulp Fiction, less of a shock than it might have been a few years earlier, because of course Pulp Fiction had a meaty role for Bruce Willis. There was an ensemble film with an action star in a significant role. There were Oscars, there was box office, and these scripts were coming in, and actors were finding themselves more and more open to the approach, and get really people who even a couple of years before would have just been out of range of a project like this were inquiring about it. They wanted to know. One of those people was Robert De Niro. Because what Mangold realised is, once you've got a star, who on earth do you put opposite Sylvester Stallone in a scene? Who could go toe-to-toe with him, just in terms of the gravitas and the recognition? But Stallone's appointment and willingness to sign on the dotted line changed the target list a little bit, really, and it lifted the ambitions of who they could get, because once you cast one really significant name in a project, it tends to start to become a bit of a magnet for others to take part. And if Stallone was willing to take a really sizable risk, well, there must be something about this project. There must be something that's made him jump and decide to do it. In fact, I think it's Robert Patrick would talk about how everybody knew of the script and they all wanted in on the script, but it's whether they could get through the door. Robert De Niro was one of them. He'd seen it, he was interested, and he signed on the dotted line fairly quickly too. And then in came other names. Harvey Keitel had seen it, Liotta had seen it, and Mangold was putting together what he realised was a very masculine cast, as per the story he was trying to tell, but also not one where he really had to worry about the star power now of his film. He had to worry about the dramatic power of it. Now, when he talks about casting Copland, Robert Patrick, of course, the T-1000 in Terminator 2, is a piece of casting that Mangold seems especially proud of, because Patrick, at this point, had been defined by one role in which he didn't say that many words, and he turned into liquid metal and chased Arnold Schwarzenegger around an awful lot. It was just 2 weeks before shooting began that Patrick actually came on board the film, because, again, like lots of actors, he knew of the script. He'd been trying to get in on the film, but he happened to be in town doing promotion for the film Striptease at that point. I should come to Striptease at some point on this podcast, but I haven't as of yet. And it was while he was there, he was talking to a fellow actor, now also a director, Peter Berg, and it was Berg who just said, they've still not filled this role, you should put your name forward for it, which is exactly what Robert Patrick did. And he basically tracked down James Mangold and did a cold reading for him, and Mangold was really, really impressed. Signed him on the dotted line. There was another piece of casting that Mangold was proud of as well, a man called Arthur Nascarella, who a man with an extensive backstory and back history in law enforcement. And once his law enforcement days were over, he was coming on board as an advisor to feature films and was doing quite well, thank you very much. And so he'd been an undercover cop, and Mangold got in touch with him just to try and get details, really, to fact check his script and to work with actors where needed. But he had the moment that, by the sounds of it, that Stanley Kubrick had on with the making of Full Metal Jacket, where Kubrick hired an army veteran, R. Lee Ermey, to come and just whip the actors into shape. And then he realised, as R. Lee Ermey was shouting at the actors and telling them what to do, well, there was his gunnery sergeant for the film, and thus a film career was born. In the case of Arthur Nascarella, it wasn't quite a full-on film career in the same way, but he basically found his way into the cast by how impressed Mangold was with the way that he was working with him and the actors. Janine Garofalo was one of those who, I mean, she went against the grain, really. She actually passed on the film when it first crossed her desk because she'd just seen the title, Copland. Oh, there's another film about cops. Well, not particularly interested in that. But it was her agent who told her to seek out the film Heavy, which she did. And in her words, once she saw Heavy, she unpassed her past and was truly on board the film. For Stallone, he had to go through a regimen of putting on a lot of weight, which he admitted that he found difficult. He's talked quite candidly about this, that he found his physique in those days very much as his comfort blanket, and he almost had to justify the fact that he was eating so much food and bulking up to the people around him and just like, oh, it's for a role, it's for a role. And it took him quite a while to get out of that mindset. But he turned up on set in the summer of 1996 in a very different shape to the one that people had been used to seeing him on throughout the action movies of the previous years. Filming began on Copland in July of 1996, and as Mangold would talk about, hierarchy was really out on the set of the film, that this was an ensemble movie, and the writer-director treated it as such. If he wasn't massively experienced with directing motion pictures, he was nonetheless plunging straight in with this and kind of realising he just had to somehow make this happen. He had De Niro for the first 2 weeks of shooting, and he said that he felt De Niro helped set the tone of the film as well, that this was an independent production, but you still had to turn up and put in a shift. De Niro would talk about how he liked Mangold's confidence. I mean, he gives very brief interviews on the DVD as well. But what it meant as a result of the scheduling was that the first shot of Copland to be captured on film was one of the most pivotal scenes, where you've got De Niro and Stallone basically going head to head in an office together. That, I mean, for Stallone, who's thoroughly out of his comfort zone, the first scene that he was going to shoot for the movie pitted him against one of the most acclaimed directors of his generation. Mind you, as Sean Levy talks about in his biography of Robert De Niro, he wasn't doing his legendary levels of research for this particular part. To quote the book, it says De Niro didn't pour himself into the role. He played cops before. I mean, he basically knew what he was doing. He trusted the director. He said he spent a little time boning up on the hierarchy of rank in the NYPD and on the off-duty lifestyle habits of cops, particularly the ones who chose to live outside the city. Otherwise, he knew with this particular film that he was merely a piece of the puzzle. So there were still complicated things that they needed to shoot, even though this was at heart an independent movie, albeit one that was being backed with Miramax money. So there was a sequence that takes place on the George Washington Bridge in New York, a very popular and a very populous bridge as well. But inevitably they had limited time to use it, that they were only afforded a few hours across a series of nights to get the material that they need. And there's a fairly extensive sequence really that takes place in that location. And so the way it had to work was they had to get everybody lined up on the bridge at 11:30 at night. They had to get all the cars there, the actors there, all the equipment there, so that as soon as midnight struck, when they were actually allowed to film, they could get underway. Then come 4 o'clock in the morning, they had to be clearing it up. They had to be off the bridge on time, else they were in trouble. And for 4 nights running, they had to do this. Mangold found it quite testing. At one point, he was losing his voice, he talks about by the end of it. They lost one evening of shooting, pretty much entirely to fog as well, but that was all the time that they had. And so they had to restage moments on a sound stage a bit further in the production. But they got the footage that they needed, and Mangold was surprised and thrilled really by the collaboration that was taking place, that the cast were pretty much getting along. But again, they wanted to be there for the script. There was the feeling that this was a really special script and a really special project to be a part of. Could it be the next Pulp Fiction? I mean, I would imagine that was at the back of one or two people's minds. Going back to Kathy Conward, who was one of the producers of the film, well, she was doing double duties really, because she'd just come off the set of another movie that was being done for the Dimension side of Miramax. That would be called Scream. And so she'd gone from a bunch of teenagers having their first experiences on a film set to some of the most experienced actors, again, all come together for this ensemble piece. One of the methods by which Stallone used to ground himself is he kind of thought of his character in the film as a turtle that carrying the weight of the world on his back, that he was slow moving, kind of bottom of the pile. And so he did get hold of a carved turtle, and he's talked a couple of times about how he kept this turtle in his pocket, and at the start of every scene he just looked at it. That was his little tick really, so that he could remember and really get into the head of the character that he wanted to play. Now, there was one scene that didn't go particularly to plan in the shooting of it, where you've got Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro in the room, but one of them had to enter the room first, because as James Mangold realised, they couldn't both enter the room, and of course actors want an entrance. But it was a case of if you had it at the start and they both had to come in, you're starting a scene with an empty office, and that's just not visually interesting, and it's not a good thing to do. Now, this apparently took quite a while to resolve. That it was people were hanging around waiting for some kind of resolution to be put together, and so again, this is talked about on the DVD about people just waiting and just like, oh, we're here. Have they done it? No. They've done it? No. They've done it? No. And so in the end, they finally got that locked down. But there were little moments of friction that just spiked up during the filming. However, it was all done October 1996. All it had to do was go into the edit room, go through the nice, simple Miramax editing process, and all would be fine. Here we go. Even before the scandals and the crimes of Harvey Weinstein that we know about now came to light, in the 1990s, he was notorious for the way that he dealt with films and filmmakers during the post-production of their movies. Harvey Weinstein liked to have a say, and as it was his company that was putting up the money for the film, his say very often ended up going. In James Mangold, you had a headstrong director who had been willing to stand his ground in his early 20s in a role at Disney, one that ultimately cost him his job there. This was not going to be a meeting of minds in post-production, and so that is roughly how it panned out. I do want to just put in briefly that the film does have a little bit of CG work in it. I'll get to that before we get to the battle. That there is a water tower that was added in post-production at a cost of $30,000 that had to be individually signed off. The budget of the film was $15 million in the end, with actors working for scale prices on it, with the view of taking a chunk of the profits and the back end, should it go on and make mega bucks at the box office. Mangold struggled with his initial cut. He had a lot of characters and he was trying really to beat it back a bit and get them all in and make sure people had their screen time, but also that he was at heart telling the story of this new frontier western, which is what got him into this in the first place. But it got to the point, as Peter Biskind reported in his book Down and Dirty Pictures, that James Mangold and Harvey Weinstein absolutely found themselves disagreeing. That Weinstein was very much having his say on what he felt the film should look like and how he felt the film should be, and it was not tallying with the film that James Mangold came into all of this to make in the first place. And as Biskin writes, Mangold was so sick of Weinstein's interference at one point that he told his editor to remove the hard drives from the Avids, the editing system, and as Mangold recalled, I got on the subway, went up to my apartment and called Merrill Poster. Now, Merrill Poster was a production executive at Miramax who, like many others there, worked originally as an assistant to Harvey Weinstein, and she would take James Mangold's side on this particular battle, and that helped him get more of his cut through it. One of the interesting things listening to the DVD commentary on the disc release of it is, there's two cuts now in existence of Copland. There's the 105-minute version, that was the version seen on cinema screens, but eventually Mangold got the chance to go back and put material back in. Another 15 minutes of footage ended up back in the film. However, a lot of the to and froing was going on at the point the movie was in post-production, and it was also test screened as well, but that didn't work out to the film's favour really, because the invitations for the test screening that went out were, and you're just trying to get a relatively interested audience, were saying, come and watch the new Sylvester Stallone film. Well, at that point, a role hadn't come out that would change people's perception of what the new Sylvester Stallone film was going to look like. And so you had a bunch of people turn up for the test screening expecting some variant of Rocky or Rambo or even something like Daylight, and not getting what they thought. The scores that came back, which are out of 100 at test screenings, were in the 40s. This was not good. And Weinstein, as a result, mandated cuts, and he mandated reshoots, and he also new scenes as well. And Mangold, talking to Peter Biskind, said, I thought I'd plunged back into this hell of studio filmmaking. He said there was pressure to inject some buoyant feeling at the very end, show that everything turned out okay and the bad guys were punished. A scene was tacked on to that effect. At one point, the book notes, he claims somebody from Miramax called him up and told him Harvey has written a scene for the film that he'd like to read to you. It was a hell of a battle, but still there was anticipation over the release of the film, and it was premiering in New York in August of 1997, and quite a few of the cast turned up for that as well, and the response to it was good. On the whole, Sylvester Stallone took a lot of praise for his performance in the movie, but also Mangold's work was appreciated as well, and the fact that it's just such a hard-nosed and focused film was very much in its favour. What it clearly wasn't, though, and what some critics clearly went in wanting to see, was a Quentin Tarantino movie, and this, whereas Tarantino's stuff was breaking new ground and was trying lots of new things, there's something eminently traditional about the filmmaking, about the values, about the style, about the genre of Copland, and it wasn't the grenade into modern cinema that Pulp Fiction had been, which is fine. That isn't what Mangold set out to make, it's just what the ecosystem around him was expecting. So, audiences who turned up to watch the film, well, generally the response to it again was pretty good, but any hope of this being a big breakout hit would rely on word of mouth, and it just didn't get enough of it. That it went into US cinemas on the weekend of August the 15th to the 17th, 1997. This was still the point where you put a film out in August and you're seen to be just kind of dropping it at the end of the summer, really. Now, it's also a decent time to start an awards run film, and Copland was clearly going to need that if it was going to get anything kind of like the legacy, the money, the attention that Pulp Fiction had got. And it opened in first place. In fairness, $13.5 million was not bad really for the money that had been spent on it, but given the star power in there, well, there would have been at one point an expectation of a bit more. The other opener that weekend was Paul W.S. Anderson's Event Horizon with $9.5 million. I've covered that before on the podcast. In fact, I've had Paul W.S. Anderson come in and explain things about Event Horizon on the podcast too. The number 2 movie was Air Force One with $12 million million on its fourth week of release, though. That's the kind of the film people were looking to make. That was going to make a lot of money. Mel Gibson in Conspiracy Theory, opposite Julia Roberts and Patrick Stewart, was in third. The Spawn movie was in fifth. The mighty George of the Jungle in sixth. I love George of the Jungle. And also around with films like Men in Black, Picture Perfect, Contact, Air Bud was in there. It's mainly holdovers, really, from the June-July release window. But the problem that Copland faced was there was a surprising amount of competition around the corner, because Ridley Scott's G.I. Jane starring Demi Moore came out the week after. 11 million, not an awful lot, but still enough to take funds away from Copland. Money Talks introduced the world to Chris Tucker, or many people to Chris Tucker, on the big screen. That opened as well, helped itself to 10 million. Copland was down from first place to sixth on its second week of release, 7 million in the bank on its second weekend, and it was clear it was starting to struggle to get some degree of foothold. In fact, I mean, you go to the start of September, it's already down to 9th, and that would be its last appearance in the top 10. By the weekend of September the 12th to the 14th, there it was, down in 14th place as the game opens in first. Copland's US gross in the end was about $44 million, and not a bad return, really. It wouldn't travel overseas particularly well. I mean, it's very much a kind of New York State kind of story as well, which, whilst they've travelled in the past, it kind of, with effectively an independent behind it, it did dampen its chances somewhat. Still, the overall box office gross of 63 million wasn't bad at all for a movie that cost 15 million. It was just the level of expectation, really, that kind of counted against it. When it came to the Oscars, Copland nowhere to be seen. In fact, when it came to pretty much all award ceremonies that I could find, Copland nowhere to be seen. It's one of those films, though, where its legacy has continued, and it was quite interesting come the recent anniversaries of the film, that it was 25 years old last year at the point of recording, that there was a lot of affection, that Mangold did give interviews, and it's clear it's endured better. Now it's out of that initial glare and that initial period of expectation. For Sylvester Stallone, off the back of it, it wouldn't chart an immediate run straight back into the kind of acting that he'd wanted to get back to at the start of his career. He would have to go through a very bumpy few years after that. Things like the remake of Get Carter, Detox, the story of that is a story and a half. Eventually, he would find his way back to success by returning to Rocky Balboa and going a little bit back to basics. But part of that process, I'd suggest, started in 1997 with a film called Copland, which is still out there, still a surprising number of people haven't seen, and I think a treat is waiting for them. I'm just going to do my parish notices at this point. I'll do them as quickly as humanly possible. Firstly, if you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, then there are there are three main ways you can do it. If you want to support it financially and help support the Film Stories project, head over to patreon.com/Simon Brew. If you put some coins in the pot there, you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You get it ad-free as well. You find out the gossip and basically what we're up to behind the scenes. Costing you absolutely nothing is to subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice. Thank you to everybody who's done that. I know a lot of people have been doing that for me, and likewise, leaving a review, ideally a hugely positive review, costs you nothing as well, but really helps independent podcasts such as this one. Again, thank you to everyone who's taken the time and trouble to do that. Also, Film Stories magazines are on sale. If you're looking for Christmas presents, if you're looking for festive gifts, if you're looking for something for you, I mean, they're out there now. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can find our 168-page UK's biggest film magazine, latest issue for sale. Also, we've got Film Junior too, the only print magazine in the UK for youngsters, for the only one talking about films for 7 to 14-year-olds. They're also writing it as well. We're paying them to write it, and so all sorts of stuff just wrapped into that project. Again, ideal Christmas gift subscriptions. If you go to webscribe.co.uk and look up Film Junior, you'll find all of our subscription deals there. Thank you to everyone who's been spreading the word. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me just about still on Twitter at Simon Brew. I'm on Blue Sky at Simon Brew as well. Thank you to everyone who's found me there and said hello. The entire Film Stories project is at Film Stories. You'll find it on Twitter. You'll also find it on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. You'll find us on YouTube, youtube.com/filmstories. You'll find us, your Patreon again is patreon.com/Simon Brew. And then there's our website, filmstories.co.uk, which we're now doing TV and gaming stuff as well, although not to the detriment of the films, of the film material. There's loads going on that site. It's updated every weekday with a lot of stuff at the moment. So thank you again to everyone who's supporting us there. And then if you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that is where you will find our new Blu-rays of No Way Out and Bull Durham for the first time in the UK. They're on Blu-ray here. They are just shipping as this podcast is being recorded and available now. Our Blu-ray of Sneakers has sadly sold out. So I mean, I urge you to get in quick on these new ones as well. That is a lot of waffle at the end of an episode. The main thing, as always, is that you all take care, you all look after yourselves, you all stay safe and well. I'm going to go off and watch another load of films in which I will bore you about in the near future. Until then, look after yourselves, take care. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.